As you can imagine, though, even as Roosevelt is building support for his New Deal coalition, the enemies of the New Deal are going to continue to look for ways to strike it down and cause trouble for Roosevelt. Conservatives, Republicans, are looking for ways to slow it down in Congress, and the Supreme Court at the time is also very conservative and Republican, and they're going to issue a number of decisions as the Supreme Court that show they strongly oppose President Roosevelt's New Deal. An example of this is when conservative Republicans sue the government in 1935 over the creation of the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. Their job was to create new wages, or almost what you can consider a minimum wage. Roosevelt had long argued that big businesses like car companies, big businesses like steel companies, J.P. Morgan, Standard Oil, that they were all making record profits, but that their workers were suffering with wages that were way, 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 way too low, a very low wage. And what Roosevelt's going to do with the NRA is pressure these businesses so that they raise the wages that they charge their workers, so that workers can have the ability to not just live well, but also to spend more. Because let's not forget, our economy is a consumer economy, and it means we have to spend money to get our economy moving. But that's also a government regulation. Everything about this minimum wage cartoon shows government interference in business. Conservatives don't like that. They sue because they feel President Roosevelt is using too much of his power. And the Supreme Court declares that to be so. They say the National Recovery Administration is unconstitutional. It's against the law. Congress is the only people or the only group that can regulate business, not the president. If Congress wants to make a minimum wage, that's their business, but not the president. This really upsets Roosevelt because now he's going to have to find new ideas and new programs to keep those voters supporting him if he wants to win, not just in 1936, but also in 1940 if he runs again. So we're going to take a look at what Roosevelt's going to do to continue to promote people to join his New Deal coalition, even after the Supreme Court strikes down some of the programs as unconstitutional. And so as Roosevelt continues to pursue new groups to support his New Deal coalition, even as the Supreme Court is striking programs down as unconstitutional, let's take a step back and see what we've covered so far. What we've seen is, can the government fix the economy? Well, yes, it can if it can fund the second New Deal with deficit spending. But as we just saw, that the Supreme Court and conservative opponents of the second New Deal will keep President Roosevelt from doing everything. He can only do so much. Congress also has to play a role in trying to help better the lives of other people. And as we've seen, is the government responsible for the economic well-being of its citizens? Yes. And in the case of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, not just those that do manual labor, but intellectuals as well. So now we'll see what Roosevelt can do to get more people back on board, supporting him, supporting his policies, so that the country can continue to recover during the Great Depression. And we're going to take a look at here two laws in particular and their impact. The Wagner Act, which is going to help unions, and Social Security, which is going to help the elderly, both groups which will end up supporting the New Deal coalition. So here we go. FDR in 1936 and 1937 is going to begin to push for support of something called the Wagner Act. What's really interesting about this is that for the first time ever, our government is going to say, you know what, workers, you actually have the right to work together to bargain for pay and benefits. Remember, Roosevelt wants to put money into the pockets of those union members. And if they can get more money, then they can spend it and get our economy moving again. One of the ways to do that is to help unions bargain for that higher pay, that higher minimum wage. Remember, the NRA, which promoted minimum wages, was struck down as unconstitutional. So how can we begin to get those wages up in different ways? Well, let's encourage unions to bargain for them. And this law actually says, look, there's a way for you to actually guarantee that, and it's a return of that issue of arbitration. And now that it's passed in law, it's legal. You have to abide by it. So you can take your complaints in, you can complain, an independent neutral party hears and issues a decision. And that really will encourage workers to stand up for themselves. So much so that even some workers who are working for better pay, like in the automotive factories, will engage in something called sit-down strikes. Now here's how this works. In GM, General Motors, the car company up in Detroit, they're not paying their workers enough. They're not giving them the kinds of safe workplace conditions they want. So what's going to happen is that the United Auto Workers will sponsor a sit-down strike in the factory called Fisher Number 1. And they're going to be on strike for 11 days, at least in the month of February, and then it's going to actually continue on for months afterwards in different places. But what you'll see is them actually refuse to leave the factory. They move into the factory and they stay there. A diner from across the street provides them with over 2,000 meals. That doctors are brought in to care for those that are hurt and wounded when GM sends in the police to try and storm and drive the workers out. But they are so united, these workers are able to force General Motors, by shutting down their factory, by refusing to leave, to raise their pay and make their working conditions safer. And it spreads. First it's in factory Fisher Number 1, it spreads to factory Fisher Number 4, and it goes to different factories all across the country as people begin to support workers and sit down and occupy these spaces and refuse to move until their demands are met. And the public will support this. So, what does this look like then in terms of the New Deal coalition? Well, this means that Roosevelt not only has unions on his side, he has manual laborers on his side, people that do factory work. So he is able to get a lot of those people, helped by the NRA, back on board his New Deal coalition with the Wagner Act.